Abigail Carter didn't cry when William Harrington told her she was no longer needed. She'd spent 6 years keeping his estate from ruin. 6 years of pre-dawn ledgers, harvest negotiations, and silences that held entire seasons together. She set the keys on his mahogany desk, looked him square in the eye, and said, "I hope you find what you've lost before it's too late." Then she walked into the Virginia rain. Every servant in that house stopped what they were doing and followed her out the door. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We'd love to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1818 had been ruthless to Virginia. The tobacco fields at Harrington Estate stretched wide and golden in the heat, rows running so perfect and long they looked like something God had combed into the earth with patient hands. The creek that cut through the lower pasture had dropped to a trickle by July, and the air smelled of dry grass and the particular kind of dust that settles into a person's lungs and stays there through August. Abigail Carter had watched 2 summers just like this one come and go. She'd watched 3 before that were worse. She'd watched the harvest numbers dip in 1813, then again in 1815, and both times she had been the one sitting at the desk in the estate office long after the candles burned low, reworking the contracts and renegotiating with the grain merchants and quietly saving a fortune that its owner didn't even know was failing. She had been 20 years old when she arrived at Harrington Estate, a school teacher's daughter from a small county in the western foothills, educated past what anyone expected of a woman in her circumstances, carrying a leather satchel full of her father's accounting ledgers and a letter of reference from the county minister. Her father had died owing debts that would have swallowed the family whole if Abigail hadn't taken work by the end of that same month. She had not come to Harrington Estate expecting anything more than a governess position and a room above the kitchen. She stayed 6 years because she turned out to be the most capable estate manager William Harrington had ever employed, and because William Harrington, for most of those 6 years, had not been present to understand that. He had gone back to the war. Not because he had to, because he was the kind of man who believed that a gentleman of Virginia had an obligation to place his body between his country and its enemies, and no fortune was worth protecting if you protected it at the cost of your honor. Abigail respected that about him. She respected it the way you respect a river, from a careful distance, with an understanding of what happens when it floods. For 6 years, she had run Harrington Estate on his behalf, under the nominal supervision of his estate steward, a thin-voiced man named Mr. Garrett, who was adequate at managing the stables and thoroughly useless at everything else. She had renegotiated 3 supplier contracts. She had identified and terminated a slow embezzlement by a foreman in the lower fields. She had managed the household staff, 15 at peak season, with fairness and consistency that kept turnover lower than any neighboring estate could claim. She had written William quarterly letters detailing every significant decision. He had written back 4 times in 6 years. Brief letters, businesslike, acknowledging that the estate appeared to be in capable hands. She had not expected warmth. She had not expected gratitude. She was a hired woman in 1818 Virginia, and she understood what that meant. What she had not expected, what nothing in her father's ledgers or her own careful observations of human nature had prepared her for, was Victoria Ashford. Victoria arrived in June. She came by private carriage from Richmond, her luggage requiring a second vehicle entirely, and she swept through the front entrance of Harrington Estate with the kind of confidence that does not ask permission to occupy a room. It simply occupies it and lets everyone else adjust. She was 40 years old, and she had never looked it. Her hair was dark, her posture was immaculate, and she wore silk in July without appearing to sweat, which Abigail found either admirable or deeply suspicious. She could never decide which. "You must be the girl who's been keeping this house together," Victoria said, when Abigail met her in the entrance hall. "I'm the estate manager, ma'am," Abigail said. "Abigail Carter." Victoria looked at her the way a woman looks at furniture she isn't sure she wants to keep. "Yes," she said. "I'm sure you've done very well." She walked past without extending her hand. Abigail stood in the entrance hall and understood, in the way she had always understood things, quietly, completely, and earlier than anyone would have liked, that something had just changed at Harrington Estate, and that the change was not going to favor her. Victoria Ashford was William Harrington's cousin. That much was known. She had married well, buried her husband 2 years prior, and retained both his considerable fortune and her family connection to the Harrington name. What Abigail did not know, what she would learn piece by piece over the following weeks, through overheard conversations and small inconsistencies in the household accounts, was that Victoria had arrived at Harrington Estate with a purpose. She wanted the estate, not through marriage, not through open contest, through William, through a version of William that she intended to shape before he had fully reacquainted himself with the life he'd come home to. William Harrington arrived home in the second week of July. Abigail heard the horses before she saw anything, and she was in the yard before most of the staff had registered the sound. Not because she was eager, she told herself it was not that, but because there were 3 contracts on her desk requiring his signature, and she had been waiting 11 days for his return to finalize the harvest agreements. She had a list. She always had a list. He came through the gate on a bay horse, taller than she remembered, thinner through the face, with the kind of quiet that a man carries back from war, like a second coat. He can't figure out how to take off. He dismounted and handed the reins to the stable boy, and he looked at the estate grounds, the way a man looks at something he's been thinking about for years and is trying to determine whether it matches what he carried in his memory. His eyes found her. She was standing 10 feet away with her satchel in one hand and her list in the other. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Harrington," she said. "Welcome home. When you're ready, I have the harvest contracts and the Q2 accounts for your review. There are also 3 matters requiring your signature before the end of the month." He looked at her for a moment that stretched slightly longer than she expected. "Good to see some things haven't changed," he said. It might have been a compliment. With William Harrington, it was always difficult to determine. "Your cousin arrived 3 weeks ago," Abigail said. "She's settled in the East Wing." Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. "I know," he said. "I invited her." He walked toward the house. Abigail stood in the July heat and decided to give him 2 days before approaching with the contracts. She was practical that way. The household shifted the way households always shift when their nominal head returns. There was a current of energy that ran through the staff, a slight recalibration of authority, a waiting to see which version of things would settle. What settled was not what Abigail had expected. Victoria moved quickly. Abigail had to give her that. Within 5 days of William's return, Victoria had established herself as the interpretive layer between Abigail and William. Every question Abigail brought to William's attention was redirected through Victoria first. Every decision was reviewed by Victoria before it reached him. And Victoria, who had spent 3 weeks learning just enough about the estate's operations to sound informed, began offering William her own assessments. "Your Miss Carter seems to have managed adequately," Victoria said one evening at dinner. Abigail knew because Ruth, who served the table, told her afterward with the particular kind of worried loyalty that longtime household staff develop for the people who treat them decently. "But adequately isn't what Harrington Estate needs now, William. It needs vision, leadership, someone with the right standing to deal with the county men of business." "Miss Carter has been dealing with the county men of business for 6 years, William said. "She's a governess, darling. She's my estate manager, who was hired as a governess, with no formal standing, no legal authority, and whose decisions have never been formally ratified by you. Any of them could be challenged." A pause. "I've had my attorney review the contracts she signed on your behalf." Another pause, longer. "And?" William said. "And they're binding, but only barely, and only because no one has chosen to challenge them yet." Abigail did not hear the rest of that conversation. She heard enough. She presented the harvest contracts to William the following morning. He received her in the office, her office, the one she had organized and managed for 6 years, the one where she could find any document in under 2 minutes in the dark. And he sat behind the desk with an expression she had not seen on him before. A kind of careful remove, like a man holding himself at a controlled distance from something he wasn't certain about. "Sit down, Miss Carter," he said. She sat. "These are the harvest contracts," she said. "The Pemberton agreement needs your signature by the 15th. The Morrison arrangement has already been renewed. I took the liberty, as we discussed in my March letter. I'd like to review the full accounts," he said. "Not just the current contracts, everything, the last 6 years." She looked at him. "Of course," she said. "I can have them compiled. Victoria's attorney will be conducting the review." The room was very quiet. "Your cousin's attorney," Abigail said. "He's thorough. It's simply a formality." "I understand," Abigail said. She did not say, "I have kept every record, every receipt, every entry, and every correspondence, and I am not afraid of any review you care to conduct." She did not say, "I know exactly why this is happening, and it is not about the accounts." She said, "I'll make everything available." She stood and walked to the door. "Miss Carter." She stopped but did not turn. "I appreciate your years of service here," William said. "Whatever the outcome of the review." She turned then. She looked at him directly, the way her father had taught her to look at a man when he needed to understand he was being heard completely. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "I have never taken a single coin from this estate that was not in my contract. I have never made a decision I was not authorized to make. And every dollar I saved and every contract I signed is documented in triplicate in those filing cabinets." She paused. "Whatever your cousin's attorney is looking for, he won't find it." She left. She was shaking by the time she reached the hallway, and she pressed her hand flat against the wall and breathed until it stopped. She had learned that from her father, too. The review took 9 days. Abigail cooperated fully. She answered every question, produced every document, and said nothing to the staff beyond what they needed to know to continue their work. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She did not, in any observable way, indicate that she understood what was happening. What was happening was this. Victoria Ashford had prepared a set of documents, carefully, over the 3 weeks before William's return, that told a particular story about Harrington Estates accounts. Numbers transposed, dates altered, a trail of small, plausible-looking irregularities that, taken together, suggested someone had been quietly siphoning funds from the estate over the course of several years. Not a large sum. That would have been too obvious. A careful sum. A patient sum. The kind of sum that a clever woman might take without anyone noticing, if she believed no one was watching closely enough. Victoria presented her attorney's findings to William on the 17th of July. Abigail was not present. She learned what was said through Ruth, who heard it through the kitchen, which had ears in every room of the estate, the way kitchens always do. The accounts show a pattern of irregularity going back to 1815, Victoria's attorney had told William, consistent with unauthorized fund transfers to an external account. "Miss Carter's account?" William had asked. "The funds are not traceable to a named account, but the timing and the access all lead to one conclusion." A long silence. "I see," William had said. He called her to the office that evening. The light was failing outside, the kind of thick gold that Virginia July produces in its last hour before dark, and Abigail walked to the office with her hands steady and her face composed and everything inside her moving very fast. William was standing when she entered. He did not invite her to sit. "I'm going to ask you directly," he said, "and I need an honest answer." "I've never given you any other kind," she said. "Have you been taking money from this estate?" She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "The attorney's report is wrong," she said, "or it has been arranged to appear as it does." "That's a serious accusation." "Being called a thief is a serious accusation, Mr. Harrington." He looked at the floor, then back at her. "I don't know what to believe." "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "you should ask yourself who prepared that report, and what they stand to gain." His jaw tightened. "Victoria has no reason." "She has every reason," Abigail said. She kept her voice level. She had promised herself she would keep her voice level. "She arrived 3 weeks before you returned. She spent those 3 weeks learning this estate's operations. She brought an attorney with her before there was any dispute to litigate. And now there is a dispute, conveniently, the moment you come home. You're asking me to believe my cousin fabricated? I'm asking you to look at what you can verify, she said. The accounts I kept are all here. Every entry has a date, a signature, and a corresponding document. Whatever the attorney's report shows, there is a matching record for everything I have done. He studied her for a long moment, and then he said the words that she had not, for all her preparation, steeled herself quite enough to hear. I think it would be best if you took some time away from the estate, while the matter is properly investigated. The room seemed to contract slightly. You're asking me to leave, she said. I'm asking you to step back, temporarily. You're asking me to leave, she said again. Not louder, just clearer. He didn't answer. After 6 years, she said. Not accusing, just placing the fact between them, the way you'd set down something heavy. Miss Carter. I understand, she said. She did not reach for the keys on her belt immediately. She made herself take 2 breaths first, deliberate and quiet. Then she unhooked the ring of estate keys. The main house, the grain storage, the accounting office, the document room, all of it. And she set them on the edge of his desk. I hope, she said, very quietly, that you find what you've lost before someone else does. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard William say her name. She didn't stop. She came out into the main hallway, and Ruth was there. Ruth, who had worked in that kitchen for 11 years, who had 3 grandchildren and a husband buried in the churchyard, and no patience whatsoever for injustice. And Ruth looked at her with eyes that already knew. They're sending you off, Ruth said. Not a question. He's asked me to step back, Abigail said. Temporarily. Ruth's mouth pressed into a thin line. I see. The household will run fine, Abigail said. You all know what to do. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she untied her kitchen apron. Ruth? I've been here longer than you, Ruth said. And I know what I know about this house, and the people who actually kept it standing. She folded the apron over her arm. I reckon I'll be taking some time away as well. Abigail opened her mouth. Don't you argue with me, Ruth said. From down the hall came the sound of footsteps. Thomas, who managed the stables. Mary, who handled the upstairs rooms. Old Samuel, who had been groundskeeper for 20 years and had watched 3 generations of Harrington men make decisions of varying quality. Young Daniel, who was barely 19 and had learned to read because Abigail had taught him in the evenings after his work was done. One by one, they appeared in the hallway. One by one, they stopped. Abigail looked at them. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. This isn't necessary, she finally said. No, Thomas said. It ain't necessary. We're doing it anyway. She nodded once. She breathed. She picked up her satchel from where she'd set it by the door that morning. She had always kept it by the door, a habit from years of being ready to move on short notice. And she walked out of Harrington Estate into the evening air. Behind her, the sound of footsteps followed, every single one of them. She didn't look back. She was afraid that if she did, she would stop walking, and she could not afford to stop walking yet. There was too much still ahead of her, and she had always known, somewhere in the careful back part of her mind, where she kept the things she didn't let herself think about too directly, that this day might come. She had her father's lesson and her own records and the knowledge that truth, if you kept it organized and documented and ready, did not stay buried forever. She walked out into the Virginia summer evening with nothing behind her but the soft sound of loyal footsteps, and nothing ahead of her but the road, and everything she needed to fight with held close against her side in a leather satchel that had survived worse than this. Harrington Estate would learn her name before this was finished. Everyone would. The road away from Harrington Estate was 3 miles of packed dirt that ran between tobacco fields and old fence lines before it reached the county road proper, and Abigail walked every inch of it in the failing light with 15 people behind her, and not a single word spoken between them. That was the thing about people who had worked hard their whole lives. They understood that some moments didn't require commentary. She had told herself, walking out that door, that she would not cry until she was alone. She had kept that promise for approximately half a mile before Ruth pulled up alongside her and took her arm without asking, and the warmth of that, the simple, human warmth of someone choosing to stand beside you when they had no obligation to, cracked something open that Abigail had been holding shut for 9 days. She pressed her lips together and kept walking. Ruth didn't say anything, she just held on. By the time they reached the county road, Abigail had herself back under control. She stopped and turned and looked at the 15 people standing behind her in the dust and the last of the evening light. And she felt something she had no clean word for. Not quite gratitude, not quite grief, somewhere between the two. "You can't all stay away," she said. "The harvest season starts in 6 weeks. If the estate is short-staffed, then the estate is short-staffed," Thomas said. He was holding his hat in both hands and turning the brim slowly, the way he did when he was saying something he'd already decided and didn't intend to argue about. "That ain't our problem right now, Miss Carter. It'll be your livelihoods. So will not being able to look at ourselves in the mirror," he said. She looked at them all for a long moment. Old Samuel, who had not left Harrington property in 11 years. Young Daniel, whose face was determined in the way only a 19-year-old's face can be determined, without any of the caution that experience carves into a person. Mary, who had left a perfectly warm kitchen supper half-finished on the table because she'd heard what was happening and hadn't stopped to think about it, just moved. "Where will you go tonight?" Abigail asked. "My sister's place is 2 miles past the mill," Ruth said. "She's got room. She's been wanting me to visit since March anyhow, so I reckon this is just me finally getting around to it." A sound moved through the group. Not quite laughter. Something lighter than grief. "All right," Abigail said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "All right, one night, and tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." What came next arrived considerably faster than tomorrow. Ruth's sister was a woman named Clara, who was shorter and louder than Ruth and possessed of the particular gift that some people have of turning a crisis into a supper. Within an hour of 15 people arriving unannounced at her door, there was food on the table, pallets on the floor, and a fire going in the hearth despite the July heat, because, as Clara put it, people need something warm when the world's been cold to them. Abigail sat at that table and ate because Ruth put the plate in front of her and stood there until she did, and she listened to the voices around her. Thomas and Samuel arguing quietly about the lower field drainage system. Mary and Clara establishing an immediate and thorough friendship. Daniel asking questions about everything, because Daniel was constitutionally incapable of silence. And she let the noise of other people fill the space that the quiet of the last 9 days had carved into her. She was thinking. She was always thinking. It was the thing people misunderstood about her. They saw a woman who was calm, and they assumed she was passive. Calm and passive were not the same thing. Calm was what you needed to be when the thinking had to be done right. Victoria had prepared those documents before William came home. That meant she had access to the accounts before the review. That meant someone inside the estate had helped her, or she had found another way in, or, and this was the thread that Abigail kept pulling on, the documents weren't based on the real accounts at all. They were constructed, which meant there would be inconsistencies. Small ones, maybe. But they would be there. Abigail had copies of everything. Her father had taught her that. Keep copies. Not because you expect to be accused of something, but because memory fades and paper doesn't. And a woman doing work in a world that does not naturally credit her for it needs more than her word to stand on. She had her copies in the leather satchel that was currently sitting beside her chair at Clara's table. And she had been keeping those copies organized in the same system her father had used, which meant she could find any entry from any month of the last 6 years in under 3 minutes. Victoria's attorney had 9 days and access to the original files. Abigail had 6 years and intimate knowledge of every number she had ever written down. She was not afraid of a contest between those two positions. What she was afraid of, and she admitted it to herself quietly, in the part of her mind she kept private, was that it wouldn't matter. That William Harrington had already decided. and that the review and the attorney and the documents were all just the formal architecture of a decision that had been made the moment Victoria arrived and started talking into his ear. That the truth, however clearly she could present it, would run up against a man's preference for the version of reality his cousin had constructed, and truth would lose, the way truth sometimes did when it was inconvenient for the people who had the power to choose. She pushed that thought aside. She was practical. She dealt in what was, not what might be. What was? She had documentation. She had witnesses. She had 15 people sitting around and on the floor of Clara's house who had watched her run that estate with accuracy and fairness for 6 years. And she had, somewhere in the files she hadn't yet fully reviewed, a feeling, a specific, professional instinct, that Victoria had made a mistake. Frauds always made mistakes, not because they were careless, because they were confident. Confidence made people skip steps. She excused herself from the table and took her satchel to the corner of the room where the light was best and started going through her copies, page by page, with the same systematic patience she'd applied to everything for 26 years. She was going to find it. She found the first inconsistency at close to midnight. It was small. A single entry dated March 14, 1816, in Victoria's attorney's version of the accounts. A withdrawal notation for $12 drawn against the household maintenance fund. Abigail's copy showed no such withdrawal for that date. What it showed instead was an expenditure of $12 on the 14th for replacement timber for the east fence, documented with a receipt signed by the lumber merchant and countersigned by old Samuel, who had been present for the delivery. The $12 hadn't disappeared. It had been moved in Victoria's version, shifted to look like a cash withdrawal with no corresponding record, the kind of entry that suggested someone had pocketed the money. But Abigail had the receipt. She set it aside and kept going. By 2 in the morning, she had found 7 more. All of them the same method, real transactions, properly documented in her records, recast in Victoria's version as unattributed withdrawals. It was elegant, she had to admit. If you didn't have the originals, and if you didn't know the operations of the estate intimately enough to know that $12 in March of 1816 absolutely went to fence timber, because the east fence had been failing since 1815, and she'd been putting off the repair, and finally approved it after the third hard freeze. If you didn't know all of that, the altered version looked plausible. She knew all of that. She organized the discrepancies into a single document, cross-referenced against her originals, and sat back and looked at what she had. It was enough. It wasn't everything. She would need more to fully demonstrate the pattern, and she suspected there were more inconsistencies buried in the earlier years that she hadn't had time to reach yet. But it was enough to establish that the alterations existed, that they followed a consistent method, and that whoever had made them had access to the estate accounts, but not to Abigail's personal copies. She had one question left, and it was the one that kept her awake past 2 in the morning and into 3. How had Victoria gotten access to the originals? The accounting office was locked. Abigail had the only key. She reached into the satchel and pulled out the ring of estate keys she had. No. She had left those on William's desk. She had set them down deliberately and walked away, and she had not taken the accounting office key separately because she hadn't thought to, because she had been holding herself together with both hands at that point and not thinking about keys. But she had the key to her own rooms. And in her rooms, in the locked box under the floorboard where she kept things she didn't want found, her father's letters, her own private journal, the copies. She had a spare key to the accounting office. She had made it 3 years ago, after she'd locked herself out during a harvest emergency and spent 40 minutes hunting for her ring before finding it in her coat pocket. The spare key was in her room, in a box under a floorboard, in a room at Harrington Estate. She sat very still and thought about that. Then she thought about Victoria arriving 3 weeks before William, with a full set of luggage and an attorney in tow. And she thought about how 3 weeks was a long time if you were looking for something specific and didn't need to be subtle about it, because there was nobody senior enough to question you. She thought about Mr. Garrett, the estate steward, who was inadequate at most things, but adequate at doing whatever the person with the most apparent authority told him to do. She thought about the fact that her spare key was now almost certainly gone. "You're still awake," Ruth said from the doorway. Abigail looked up. Ruth was in her nightclothes, carrying a candle, and she had the expression she used when she had decided something and was going to say it regardless of whether it was convenient. "I found what she changed," Abigail said. Ruth came fully into the room and set the candle on the table beside Abigail's papers. She looked at the documents without touching them, reading the way a person reads who learned later in life and never stopped being deliberate about it. "You can prove it?" she said. "I can prove the discrepancies exist," Abigail said. "I can prove that the official version doesn't match the receipts. What I can't prove yet, not from these papers alone, is that the changes were deliberate. Someone could argue they were clerical errors." "Who's going to argue that?" "Victoria's attorney." Ruth made a sound that was not a word, but communicated a complete opinion. "I need the original account books," Abigail said. "The ones in the accounting office. My copies show what the numbers should be, but the originals would show the alterations directly. There would be evidence of the changes, places where ink was added or dates were overwritten. That kind of thing doesn't disappear. So go get them. They're at the estate." "I know where they are." Abigail looked at her. "Ruth, I can't go back to the estate. I was asked to leave." "You were asked to step back," Ruth said, using the exact language Abigail had used on the road, with the flat precision of a woman who listened carefully. "Temporarily." Those were the words. The intent was clear. "The intent of a man who didn't think hard enough before he spoke ain't the law," Ruth said. "And those account books are the property of Harrington Estate. You were the estate manager. You have a professional obligation to ensure they're accurate." Abigail opened her mouth. "I'm not saying charge in the front door," Ruth said. "I'm saying the accounting office window has been unlocked since February, because you asked Thomas to fix the latch, and Thomas forgot, and you forgot to follow up because you were managing harvest contracts. And I know that because Thomas told me, because Thomas tells me everything when he feels guilty about it." The room was very quiet. "You've been thinking about this," Abigail said. "I've been thinking about you," Ruth said. "Which is mostly the same thing right now." Thomas drove her at 4 in the morning in Clara's farm wagon, moving slow and quiet along the road with no lantern lit, because the moon was enough and the dark was a reasonable precaution. He didn't ask her anything beyond whether she was sure, and when she said yes, he nodded and shook the reins, and that was the end of the conversation. The accounting office window was, as Ruth had described, unlocked. Abigail was inside in under a minute, moving in the dark by memory, because she had organized this room herself and knew it the way she knew her own breathing. She went directly to the files for 1815 and 1816, pulled the original ledger volumes, and stood in the dark with her hands on 6 years of work. She opened the 1816 volume to March. Even by moonlight, she could see it. The entry for March 14 had been altered. The original ink, her handwriting, was still there underneath. The ghost of the real numbers visible where the false ones had been written over with a slightly different shade. Someone had tried to match the ink color and had not quite succeeded. The overlay was subtle. You would not see it if you weren't looking for it, or if you didn't know the original. She knew the original. She worked quickly. She couldn't take the ledgers. Their absence would be noticed, and she needed the estate to keep operating normally for what she was planning. But she had brought paper, and she had brought her father's old copying method. Trace the relevant entries, note the page, note the volume, note the date. Record the discrepancy between the overwritten version and the ghost underneath. She did this for 8 entries before she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. She did not panic. She had always been good in moments that required the opposite of panic. She eased the ledger back into place, gathered her papers, and pressed herself flat against the wall beside the window. The footsteps passed. She counted to 30. Then she went back out the way she'd come in, dropped quietly to the ground, and walked back to the wagon where Thomas was waiting with the horses steady and his hat pulled low. "Get what you needed?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and turned the wagon back toward the road. She sat beside him in the pre-dawn dark with the papers held carefully in her lap, and felt something she hadn't felt in 9 days. Not quite confidence. Something older than confidence, quieter, The thing that sits underneath confidence, when confidence is built on something real. She had the truth. Now she needed someone with the authority to use it. She needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. A lawyer who could be trusted, who understood estate law, and who would not dismiss her because she was a woman who had shown up on his doorstep at an unreasonable hour with a satchel full of documents. That combination, she was well aware, was not common. What she had was the name of one man who might fit the description. Elias Drummond, who had an office in Fredericksburg, who had known her father, and who had written her a letter 4 years ago saying that if she ever needed counsel in a professional matter, she should come and see him. He owed her father that much. She had kept the letter. She kept everything. Fredericksburg was a full day's ride. She went. Ruth had pressed money into her hand that morning, not asking and not accepting argument, and Thomas had offered to drive her to the coach stop, and young Daniel had appeared at the last moment with a wrapped parcel of food from Clara's kitchen, with the earnest determination of someone who needed to do something useful and had settled on this. "You'll come back?" Daniel asked. "I'll come back," she said. "And you'll fix it?" She looked at him. 19 years old, and he had walked off a job because he believed it was the right thing to do. She thought about his face bent over a primer in the evenings, learning to read letter by letter, and the particular brightness that had come into his expression the first time he made it through a full page without stopping. "I'm going to fix it," she said. She said it like she meant it. She did mean it. Elias Drummond was 62 years old, had practiced law in Virginia for 35 years, and was the kind of man who had seen enough nonsense in his career that very little surprised him. He received Abigail in his office at 3 p.m. of the following day, offered her a chair and a glass of water, and listened without interrupting for 20 minutes while she laid out everything. Then he looked at the documents she spread across his desk. He was quiet for a long time. "You made copies of everything," he said. "My father's practice," she said. He always said a woman needed paper on her side because the world wasn't always inclined to take her word for it. "Your father," Drummond said, "was a wise man." He turned another page. "These alterations in the ledger, you saw them yourself? Original entries underneath the false ones?" "Yes, I documented the discrepancy and the page references. And you have receipts corresponding to the legitimate transactions. For all 8 of the discrepancies I've identified so far. I believe there are more, but those are the ones I had time to document." He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Miss Carter," he said, "what you're describing is fraud, document fraud, against an estate managed by a licensed attorney acting on behalf of a party with a financial interest in the estate. That is a serious matter." "I know," she said. "It will require a formal proceeding, testimony, public examination of the records." "I know," she said. "And you're asking me to represent you." "My father said you were a man who cared about what was right," she said. "He said if I ever needed someone who wouldn't be moved by pressure, you were that person." Drummond looked at her for a long moment. "Your father," he said again, "was a wise man." He picked up his pen. "Tell me again from the beginning," he said. "This time, I'm taking notes." She told him everything. Outside the office window, the Virginia afternoon moved on without them. Heat settling into evening, the light changing from gold to copper to the early purple of a summer dusk. Inside, Abigail Carter sat across from a man with a pen and 35 years of experience and told the truth, systematically, with receipts, and felt the machinery of justice begin, very slowly, to turn. Back at Harrington Estate, things were not going well. This Abigail did not know yet, but she would learn it in pieces over the following days through the particular network of information that develops naturally among people who care about the same things. Ruth had her sources. Thomas had his. Old Samuel, who said very little but observed everything, had connections in the county that ran deeper than anyone fully mapped. What they reported was this: the harvest negotiations had stalled within 48 hours of Abigail's departure. The Pemberton contract, the one requiring William's signature by the 15th, the one Abigail had been trying to get in front of him the day he arrived home, had lapsed, and Pemberton had taken his business to the Henderson farm. That was $600 of annual revenue, gone. The Morrison arrangement, which Abigail had already renewed, and which needed only William's ratifying signature, had been reviewed by Victoria's attorney and declared, incorrectly but confidently, to be insufficiently binding, leading William to attempt a renegotiation that Morrison was not interested in conducting, because the original terms had been fair. And why would a man renegotiate a fair deal with someone who came to him suggesting it wasn't good enough? Morrison had not been warm about it. Additionally, Mr. Garrett, left to manage the operational day-to-day without Abigail, had made 3 decisions in 4 days that were going to create problems by September. He'd approved an irrigation change to the South Fields that reversed a drainage improvement Abigail had implemented in 2015. He'd paid an equipment supplier 2 weeks early, which freed up no goodwill but depleted the emergency maintenance fund. And he had informed the remaining household staff, the few who had not walked out, that their quarterly bonuses would be under review, which was his way of handling a situation he didn't understand, and which was going to result in the departure of the only 3 kitchen workers who hadn't left with Abigail. William knew some of this, not all of it. Victoria was managing what information reached him, and she was good at managing information. But William Harrington was not a stupid man. He was a proud man, and he was a man who had been steered wrong, and he was currently living in a house that felt subtly wrong in ways he could not fully articulate. Too quiet in the wrong places, too disorganized in the small ways that compound into large ones, running on the memory of a system that had been built by someone who was no longer there. On the evening of the 4th day after Abigail's departure, he sat in the office, her office, his desk, the room that still smelled faintly of the ink she used, and opened the top drawer looking for the Pemberton contract. It was not there. He looked in the second drawer. Not there either. He spent 20 minutes going through every drawer in that desk, and then the filing cabinet, and then the shelves, and he could not find a single document related to the Pemberton agreement in a room that had, for 6 years, contained every document he had ever needed within arm's reach. He sat back in the chair and put both hands on the desk and looked at the ceiling. Mr. Harrington. He turned. Mr. Garrett was in the doorway, holding a sheaf of papers with the expression of a man who was about to say something he'd been rehearsing. The Southfield crew is asking about the irrigation schedule, Garrett said. There seems to be some confusion about the new arrangement. What new arrangement? I approved a change to the flow direction, sir, to simplify the... Who authorized you to change the irrigation? Garrett blinked. It seemed the practical... Who authorized you, William said, very carefully, to change a drainage system that has been operating successfully for 3 years? Garrett opened his mouth, closed it. Miss Carter had a system, William said. Not quite to Garrett, partly to himself. A system for everything, and that system worked. He looked at the empty desk surface in front of him. Where are the harvest contracts, Garrett? I believe that is, Victoria's attorney may have... Find them, William said, tonight. And in the morning, I want a full account of every decision you've made since Miss Carter left. He stood and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. Yes, sir, Garrett said, and retreated. William stood alone in the office that felt wrong in a way he was beginning to understand, and he thought about a woman setting a ring of keys on his desk, with the steadiness of someone who has already decided not to fall apart in front of you, and saying words he had not let himself think about too carefully until this exact moment. I hope you find what you've lost before someone else does. He was beginning to understand that she had not been talking only about herself. He had 4 days until the formal investigation hearing that Victoria's attorney had scheduled with the county magistrate. 4 days in which the shape of the situation around him was continuing to clarify in ways he did not find comfortable. He did not know yet that Abigail Carter was sitting in a lawyer's office in Fredericksburg, building a case with the patience and precision of someone who had been keeping accurate records for 6 years and had always known, somewhere in the careful back of her mind, that she might eventually need them. He did not know yet what was coming, but he was beginning to feel the edges of it, the particular pressure of a situation that is not what it appeared to be, closing in slowly from all sides like a Virginia summer that had been building toward a storm for weeks. The storm was coming. Abigail Carter had always been good at weather. The hearing was set for July 22nd. Elias Drummond filed his notice of appearance on Abigail's behalf on the 19th, and Abigail learned secondhand, through Ruth, who learned through a cousin who worked at the dry goods store 2 blocks from the magistrate's office, that Victoria's attorney, a man named Gerald Ashworth, had received the filing with visible displeasure and immediately requested a delay. The magistrate denied the delay. That was the first good thing that had happened in 11 days, and Abigail let herself feel it for exactly the length of time it took her to walk from the window to her chair at Clara's table. Then she sat down and went back to work. She had spent 5 days in Fredericksburg with Drummond, going through everything twice. His clerk, a young man named Peter, who was meticulous in the way that young men become when they have found the work they are meant for, had cross-referenced every discrepancy Abigail had documented against the copies she carried in her satchel. They had found 14 alterations total. 14 entries where legitimate, documented transactions had been rewritten in the official ledgers to appear as unattributed withdrawals. 14 places where Victoria Ashford's version of the accounts diverged from Abigail's copies in ways that were not clerical error. Clerical error did not follow a pattern. These did. Every alteration followed the same method. Every one selected a legitimate expense that had no witness beyond Abigail herself, no second signature, no delivery receipt from an outside party, no entry in correspondence. Every one converted a real cost into a phantom withdrawal. It was precise. It was practiced. And it told Abigail something important about the person who had done it. Victoria had not improvised this. She had studied the accounts long enough to identify the vulnerable entries, the ones with minimal paper trails, before she altered anything. That took time. More time than 3 weeks. She brought this to Drummond on the morning of the 20th. She had access before she arrived, Abigail said. These selections, she knew which entries to change. That means she reviewed the accounts before she came to Harrington Estate. Drummond looked up from the document he was reading. How would she have accessed them remotely? She wouldn't, Abigail said. But Mr. Garrett might have. He handles routine correspondence. If she wrote to him, framed it as a family inquiry, a concern about William's affairs while he was away, Garrett would have sent her whatever she asked for. He wouldn't have seen anything wrong with it. Can you prove that? Not yet, she said. But Garrett is not a man who destroys letters. He keeps everything in a correspondence file in the stable office. I've seen it. He's thorough about correspondence, even when he's useless about everything else. Drummond set down his pen. Miss Carter, he said, do you understand what you're describing? This is not a simple dispute about account discrepancies. This is a coordinated scheme. Premeditated fraud against a legal estate. If you're right, we're talking about criminal conduct, not just civil liability. I know, she said. That changes the nature of what we're walking into on the 22nd. I know that too, she said. Does it change whether you'll represent me? He looked at her for a long moment, the way he had looked at her on the first day, measuring, not unkind. No, he said. It does not. Then we need to get that correspondence file. Ruth handled it. Abigail had not asked her to. She had mentioned the correspondence file to Ruth that evening, because she told Ruth most things by that point. Ruth had become the kind of person in a crisis that you can't quite operate without. The one who takes information and quietly turns it into action before you finish deciding whether to ask her to. 2 days before the hearing, Ruth returned from an errand she had described only as seeing to something, and placed a packet of folded letters on Clara's table in front of Abigail. Garrett sends his regards, Ruth said. More or less. Abigail looked at the letters. How? I told him I was retrieving some of my personal belongings from the estate, Ruth said, settling into her chair with the composure of a woman who had done nothing unusual. And while I was there, I mentioned to him that the magistrate's proceeding might involve questions about correspondence he'd sent to Mrs. Ashford in the spring. She paused. He turned about 4 different colors. Ruth, I did not threaten him, Ruth said, with great dignity. I simply observed, in a general way, that when people are examined under formal legal proceedings, the question of what documents they possess and what they sent to whom tends to come up, and that voluntarily providing relevant correspondence beforehand tends to be viewed more favorably than having it demanded. Abigail looked at the letters. "He gave them to you willingly." "He gave them to me with considerable relief," Ruth said. "I believe he has been aware for some days that he was used in a manner he didn't fully understand, and he is a man who would very much like for that to not be his legal problem." Abigail opened the first letter. It was dated February 3, 1818, 4 months before Victoria arrived. It was addressed to Mr. Clarence Garrett, estate steward, Harrington Estate, and it was signed Victoria Ashford, and it requested, in warm and cousinly tones, a full accounting of the estate's financial position, expressed as a family concern for William's affairs during his continued absence. Garrett had responded within the week. His reply, a copy of which he had also, with Garrett's characteristic clerical thoroughness, kept for himself, enclosed a full summary of the estate accounts. The second letter, dated March, requested clarification on specific line items. The third, dated April, asked for copies of the original ledger pages for 1815 and 1816. Garrett had sent them. Abigail sat back and looked at the ceiling and breathed out slowly. There it was, the complete picture, assembled from its pieces. Victoria had requested the original ledger pages in April. She had spent May and June preparing the altered versions. She had arrived in June with her attorney and her fabricated documents, and 3 weeks to position herself before William came home. It had been planned since at least February. She brought the letters to Drummond the next morning. He read them without speaking. When he finished, he set them down and folded his hands and was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that Abigail began to measure it. "Well," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "This changes things considerably." "Yes," she said again. "Gerald Ashworth is going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow, believing this is a straightforward dispute over account irregularities, and he is going to discover that it is not." "That is what I'm hoping," Abigail said. Drummond allowed himself a small, precise smile. "Your father," he said, for the third time since she'd come to his office, "was a very wise man." The magistrate's hearing was held in the Harrington County Courthouse, a building that smelled of old wood and summer heat, and the particular solemnity of a place where things were decided. It was open to the public, because such proceedings in 1818, Virginia, were public by custom, and because Gerald Ashworth had not been quiet about the nature of the case. That had been a miscalculation on his part. He had expected the public nature of the proceeding to work in Victoria's favor, a well-connected widow of property, publicly exposing a fraud by a hired woman of no social standing. He had expected the audience to arrive with their sympathies already arranged. He had not expected Abigail Carter to arrive with Elias Drummond and a satchel full of original documentation and the Garrett correspondence. He had not expected the 15 people who filed into the public gallery behind Ruth, who had come without being asked, because they had been there for 6 years and knew what they'd seen, and because some things you just show up for. He had not expected old Samuel, who was 70 years old and had the bearing of a man who has seen every variety of human behavior and is not easily moved, to sit in the front row of the public gallery and look at Gerald Ashworth with the calm, settled authority of a man who knew exactly what the truth was and was prepared to wait as long as it took. Victoria arrived with William. Abigail saw him when he came through the door. She did not let herself look for longer than a moment. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been sleeping badly and thinking hard, which in her experience were often the same thing. He met her eyes across the room for one moment, and she looked away first. Not from weakness, from concentration. She needed to be sharp right now. She needed all of herself in the room, not any part of it occupied with William Harrington, and the complicated ache of looking at someone who had failed you in a moment that mattered. There would be time for that later. Right now, she had work to do. Gerald Ashworth opened the proceedings with confidence. He was a tall man with a studied manner and the kind of voice that was accustomed to filling rooms, and he presented Victoria's case with the polished efficiency of someone who believed he had already won. The account irregularities. The pattern of unattributed withdrawals. The total amount, $342 over 3 years. That could not, according to his analysis, be accounted for by any legitimate expense. He said the word governess 4 times in his opening remarks. Not estate manager, governess. Abigail noted it and said nothing. When it was Drummond's turn to address the magistrate, he did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply stood and said, with the measured authority of a man who had been practicing law for 35 years and had learned that the truth does not require decoration. Your Honor, we will demonstrate this morning that every withdrawal cited in Mr. Ashworth's report corresponds to a fully documented, legitimate estate expense. We will further demonstrate that the discrepancies in the official ledgers are not the result of theft. They are the result of deliberate alteration. The room went quiet in a particular way. The kind of quiet that happens when a word lands that everyone feels. Victoria did not move, but Abigail, who was watching her without appearing to, saw her left hand press flat against the surface of the table in front of her. Just for a moment. Just long enough to mean something. She knows, Abigail thought. She knows what we have. She doesn't know how much. Drummond called Abigail first. She took the chair that served as witness seating, set her satchel on her lap, and looked at the magistrate, a heavy-set man named Judge Carr, who had the expression of someone who intended to hear everything before deciding anything. And she answered every question Drummond put to her with the same systematic precision she brought to everything. The March 14, 1876 entry. The $12 timber purchase. The receipt, signed by the lumber merchant and countersigned by Samuel. The corresponding entry in her personal copy, dated and documented. The alteration in the official ledger. The overwritten ink. The ghost of the original numbers visible beneath. Drummond placed her copy of the entry beside the tracing she had made of the official ledger entry, and he placed them both before Judge Carr. These are the same entry? Judge Carr said. They are, Your Honor. The copy represents the original transaction as I recorded it. The tracing represents the same entry as it currently appears in the official ledger. You will observe that the transaction type has been changed, the notation altered, and the corresponding reference removed. Judge Carr studied both documents. And the receipt? He said. Present and documented, Your Honor. Drummond set it before him. Signed by the merchant, countersigned by the estate's groundskeeper, who is present in this courtroom and available to testify. Old Samuel, from the front row, nodded once. He didn't stand. He didn't need to. His presence was itself testimony. Ashworth rose to cross-examine. Miss Carter, he said, with the particular emphasis that made it clear he was aware she preferred a different title and was declining to use it. These copies you've produced, you made them yourself? Yes. No independent verification. They are cross-referenced against every corresponding receipt and external document, she said. Each one has a matching paper trail. The verification is in the correspondence. Your correspondence. The merchant's correspondence, she said. The signed receipts. The delivery records. Documents from parties with no connection to me and no reason to falsify. She paused one beat. Unlike the documents Mr. Ashworth has presented, which were prepared by a single party with a direct financial interest in the outcome. Ashworth's jaw tightened. Objection, he said to Judge Carr. Characterization. I'll rephrase, Drummond said smoothly, rising. Your Honor, we would like to establish who prepared the documents that Mr. Ashworth's case rests upon, and when. Proceed, Judge Carr said. The Garrett letters came in during the second hour. Drummond placed them before the court one by one, in date order, with Garrett's own copies of his responses laid alongside. The February letter requesting the financial summary. The March letter requesting clarification. The April letter requesting copies of the original ledger pages. Garrett was present. Drummond had subpoenaed him the day before, a fact that Ashworth had not known until that morning, and which had produced a visible reaction that the courtroom had noticed and that Ashworth had spent considerable effort suppressing. Garrett, on the stand, was the color of old paste. He confirmed every letter. He confirmed that he had sent the ledger page copies to Victoria Ashford in April 1818, 2 months before her arrival. He confirmed that he had believed the request to be a routine family inquiry. "And had Mrs. Ashford communicated with you about estate accounts prior to February of this year?" Drummond asked. Garrett's hands, folded on his lap, pressed together. "No," he said. "That was the first time." So her interest in the detailed financial records began in February of 1818, the same month that Mr. Harrington's return from service was formally announced in the county record. Garrett looked at his hands. I suppose so." "Thank you," Drummond said. He sat down. Ashworth rose for cross-examination, took one look at Garrett's face, and made the professional calculation that there was nothing useful to extract from a man who was that visibly aware of his own culpability. He said, "No further questions," and sat back down. In the public gallery, something moved through the 15 people who had walked out of Harrington Estate behind Abigail Carter. Not a sound. A shift. The kind of collective exhale that happens when people who have been holding themselves very still allow themselves to begin to believe. Abigail did not look at them. She looked at Victoria. Victoria Ashford was sitting very straight, in the way people sit when they are working hard to look composed rather than feeling it, and she was looking at a spot on the table in front of her with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the table is the safest place to look. Ashworth leaned toward her and murmured something. Victoria said something back without moving her lips appreciably. Ashworth nodded once, the tight, reluctant nod of a man revising his strategy mid-proceeding. Then he stood. "Your Honor," he said, "we request a brief recess." "Denied," Judge Carr said. "Continue." Drummond called Samuel next. Old Samuel, who was 70 years old and had been at Harrington Estate for longer than William Harrington had been alive, came to the stand with the deliberate dignity of a man who has nothing to hide and nowhere particular to be, and is therefore entirely comfortable taking exactly as long as things require. He confirmed the timber delivery of March 1816. He had been present. He had countersigned the receipt. He had watched Abigail record the expense in the ledger that same afternoon, because she was methodical that way. She never let a transaction go unrecorded past the day it occurred. "In your 6 years observing Miss Carter manage the estate accounts," Drummond said, "did you ever observe anything that suggested financial irregularity?" Samuel considered this question with the full weight it deserved. "No," he said. "What I observed was a woman who knew where every dollar came from and where it went, and who made sure it went where it ought to." "And in your 20 years at Harrington Estate, you have seen other estate managers?" "3, Samuel said. "Before Miss Carter." "How would you characterize the condition of the estate's accounts under Miss Carter's management compared to those prior managers?" Samuel looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "Before Miss Carter," he said, "Harrington Estate lost money 3 years running. After she took over the accounts, it turned a profit 4 of the next 6 years, and the 2 years it didn't, it broke even instead of bleeding." He paused. "I have watched a lot of people manage things in my life, Your Honor. Miss Carter is the best I have seen." The courtroom was very quiet. In the public gallery, Ruth pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people do when they are managing something that is trying to become more than composure allows. Abigail sat at the table and did not permit herself to look at William Harrington. She knew he was there. She could feel the direction of him, the way you can feel a fire when you're facing away from it, the warmth existing in the air before you turn around. She did not turn around. Chow. Ashworth's case collapsed in the 3rd hour. It did not collapse dramatically. It collapsed the way structures fail when their foundation is removed. A gradual settling, a series of small failures, each one increasing the load on whatever was left standing. He called no witnesses that held. He submitted no documents that weren't immediately countered by something in Abigail's satchel. He made 3 objections that Judge Carr sustained and 7 that he didn't. And by midday, the ratio of his voice in the courtroom to Drummond's had inverted entirely from where it had been that morning. Maud, one final attempt. He rose and addressed Judge Carr with the last of his composure, and said that the documents Miss Carter had produced were unverified personal copies and could not be accepted as evidence of alteration in the official records without independent examination. Judge Carr looked at him. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, "are you requesting that I order an independent examination of the official ledgers currently held at Harrington Estate?" A beat. "Aye. Yes, Your Honor. We believe that would—" "Motion granted," Judge Carr said. "The official ledgers for 1815, 1816, and 1817 will be produced to this court by end of day tomorrow for examination by a court-appointed accountant." He looked at Ashworth. "Is that satisfactory?" Ashworth sat down. He knew. Everyone in the room could see that he knew. An independent examination of those ledgers was exactly what Victoria had been hoping to avoid, and Gerald Ashworth had just requested it himself, because refusing to request it after challenging the copies would have been more damaging than asking. Victoria's hand pressed flat against the table again. This time, she left it there. The recess came at noon. Abigail stepped outside with Drummond, and they stood in the heat of the July afternoon and said nothing for a moment, because sometimes the most professional thing is to breathe. "The ledger examination will confirm the alterations," Drummond said. "Yes," she said. "That's going to move this from a civil proceeding to something considerably more serious for Mrs. Ashford." "Yes," she said again. "Are you prepared for that?" She looked at the courthouse door. Through it, she was aware, were 15 people who had followed her out of a job on faith, and a man she had spent 6 years caring about from a careful professional distance, and a woman who had tried to take everything from her with a forged set of account books, and 3 weeks of access to another person's correspondence. "I didn't come here to be kind to her," Abigail said. "I came here to tell the truth. What happens to her because of the truth is her own doing." Drummond nodded. "Then we go back in," he said. They went back in. What happened next was not in the hearing room. It was in the narrow corridor off the main courtroom during the 15-minute recess, where Abigail had gone to collect herself and instead found herself standing 6 feet from William Harrington. He had come around the far corner. Neither of them had expected the other. They stood in the corridor and looked at each other, and the sound of the courtroom behind them was muffled by the old walls, and there was nothing between them but 12 days of silence and 11 feet of old wooden floor. "Miss Carter," he said. She waited. "I owe you." "Not here," she said. "Not now. Abigail." It was the first time he had used her given name in 6 years of acquaintance, and it landed differently than she had expected. Heavier, like something set down that had been carried a long time. "I need you to know that Mr. Harrington," she said, and her voice was steady because she was choosing to make it steady. "I have a proceeding to return to. Whatever you need to say to me, it will keep until there is time and space to say it properly." She looked at him directly. "Right now, I need to finish this." He looked at her for a moment that stretched. Then he stepped aside. She walked past him and back into the courtroom and sat down beside Drummond and opened her satchel and took out the next document she needed and did not allow herself to feel the full weight of that corridor exchange. Until later, much later, when the day was over and she was alone. There would be time. Right now, she had work to do. The afternoon session lasted 2 hours. Drummond presented the complete picture methodically, brick by brick. The February correspondence initiating Victoria's access to the accounts, the April request for original ledger pages, the timeline of alterations cross-referenced against the dates. The copies were in Victoria's possession, the 14 documented discrepancies, the pattern of selection that demonstrated deliberate targeting of low documentation entries. He did not editorialize. He did not perform outrage. He laid the facts in order and let them be facts. Judge Carr listened to everything. When Drummond finished, Judge Carr looked at Ashworth. "Does counsel for Mrs. Ashford wish to respond to the timeline as presented?" Ashworth stood. I was a professional, and professionals don't surrender visibly. He made arguments about chain of custody and the nature of copies and the insufficient verification of the correspondence timeline. He was measured and and entirely unconvincing, because competence cannot compensate for having the wrong facts. When he finished, Judge Carr made 3 notes on the paper in front of him. Then he looked up. "I am ordering the immediate seizure of the Harrington Estate ledgers for 1815 through 1817 for examination by a court-appointed accountant, he said. Pending that examination, the fraud allegations against Miss Abigail Carter are suspended. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, you are hereby directed not to leave Harrington County pending the outcome of the examination. Mr. Harrington, as the estate principal, you will make all relevant records available to the court. He paused. This proceeding will reconvene in 5 days. He stood. Everyone stood. Abigail sat for one moment after everyone else had risen, her hands flat on the documents in front of her, and she breathed in and breathed out, and let the morning drain out of her slowly, the way tension always drains when the worst of it is past. Then she stood. Ruth was already moving through the gallery door. She reached Abigail before anyone else could and grabbed both her hands and held on, and Abigail let her and said nothing, and that was exactly the right thing. Behind them, the courtroom was full of the sound of people talking, the release of a room that had been holding its breath. Drummond was accepting handshakes. The gallery was spilling into the corridor. At the far end of the room, Victoria Ashford stood alone. Ashworth had stepped away to gather his papers, and William had risen from his seat, and Victoria stood in the gap between them with the particular stillness of a woman watching a plan she had built for months coming apart at its joints, and she knew it, and everyone could see that she knew it, and still she held herself perfectly straight because that was what she had left. Abigail looked at her from across the room. Victoria looked back. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say yet. The examination would speak. The ledgers would speak. The truth, which had been sitting in Abigail's satchel since 4 a.m. on a night when she had climbed through an unlocked window and trusted that her father was right about paper, would speak. Not because she had lost, because she was done. 5 days. That was what Judge Carr had given them. And 5 days in the Virginia summer of 1818 moved the way summer days always move when something is waiting at the end of them, slower than they should, and faster than you're ready for. Abigail spent the first day back at Clara's house doing nothing intentional. Ruth recognized this for what it was, and did not press her. She put food in front of her, and refilled her coffee, and let her sit on the porch in the heat and stare at whatever she was staring at, which was not the yard, but something considerably further away. The second day, Abigail asked Thomas to drive her to the county records office. She had been thinking about something since the hearing. Something small and specific, the kind of detail that catches in a careful mind and won't release. Victoria had known which entries to alter. She had selected them with precision, targeting only the transactions with minimal external documentation. That required not just access to the ledger pages, but genuine understanding of how estate accounts worked, how paper trails were constructed, which receipts existed and which didn't. That wasn't knowledge a woman absorbed from reviewing account summaries in Richmond. Someone had explained it to her, someone who understood the accounts from the inside. Garrett had sent her the ledger copies. That much was established. But the alterations themselves, the methodology, the selection of targets, that required guidance that Garrett, who was inadequate at most things, including understanding what he was doing, could not have provided. Abigail spent 3 hours in the county records office, going through registered correspondence and public filings, and she found what she was looking for at the bottom of a stack of business registrations from March 1817. A partnership filing. Gerald Ashworth, attorney, and one Harold Vance, financial consultant, jointly registered to provide estate advisory services in Harrington County. Harold Vance. She turned the name over. She went back further. October 1816. A consulting engagement recorded in the county business ledger. Harold Vance, retained by Victoria Ashford of Richmond for estate financial analysis services. October 1816. A full year and a half before Victoria arrived at Harrington Estate. A full year and a half before Garrett sent her the ledger copies. Which meant Victoria had retained a financial consultant, a man with a working partnership with her own attorney, to analyze the Harrington Estate accounts a year before she made her approach. This had not begun in February. This had begun in 1816. Abigail sat in the records office with the filing in her hands and reconstructed the full timeline in her mind, and it was worse and more deliberate than she had understood. Victoria had been building toward this for 2 years. 2 years of preparation, analysis, professional consultation, and patience, waiting for William to come home and for her position to be ready. She brought the filing to Drummond that afternoon. He read it twice. "Harold Vance," he said. "He and Ashworth are registered partners," Abigail said. "Ashworth prepared Victoria's case. Vance advised her on the accounts. They constructed this together." Drummond set the paper down. "That means Gerald Ashworth had a personal financial relationship with Victoria Ashford through his partner before he reviewed the estate accounts as her attorney," he said. "He had a conflict of interest he did not disclose." "Yes," Abigail said. "That is an ethical violation of a magnitude that ends careers." "Yes," she said again. Drummond was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and went to the window and stood there with his back to the room, which was what Abigail had come to recognize as his version of thinking at full speed. "We bring this to Judge Carr before the reconvening," he said. "Not as part of our case, as a separate filing. The conflict of interest needs to be on record before Ashworth has any opportunity to redirect. How long will that take?" "I'll file today." He turned. "Miss Carter, do you understand what this does to their position?" "It destroys it," she said. "Completely," he said. "A fraudulent case, built on fabricated documents, prepared by an attorney with an undisclosed financial conflict, on behalf of a woman who retained professional assistance to plan the fraud 18 months in advance." He paused. "This is not a civil matter anymore. This is criminal conspiracy." The words sat in the room between them. Abigail had known it was coming to this. She had known it from the moment she saw the alterations in the March 1816 ledger by moonlight, from the moment she understood the selection methodology was too precise to be improvised. She had known, and she had kept moving forward anyway, because the alternative was to stop and let Victoria Ashford's version of the truth stand as the real one, and that she could not do. Not to herself. Not to the 15 people who had walked off a job on faith. Not to Samuel, who had worked 20 years and deserved to spend them under a truth that was real. "File it today," she said. Word travels in small counties, the way water travels through dry ground. It finds every crack and fills it before you realize it's moving. By the evening of the second day, the nature of what had happened in the courthouse was known in Harrington County in the particular way that semi-public proceedings become semi-public knowledge. Not detailed, not precise, but directionally accurate. People understood that Victoria Ashford's case against the Carter woman had not gone as expected. They understood that documents had been produced. They understood that the ledgers were being examined. They did not yet understand the full scope of it. Harrington Estate understood faster than most places, because Harrington Estate had eyes in the courthouse in the form of Thomas, who had attended the proceeding and came back with a complete account, and because the remaining household staff, the 3 kitchen workers who had not walked out with Abigail, had access to every conversation that happened within those walls. What those walls heard, 2 days after the hearing, was this. Victoria came to William's study at 9 in the evening and closed the door. What was said between them in that room was not heard in its entirety. But the kitchen girl who was carrying linens past the hallway heard enough. Victoria's voice, tight with controlled urgency. "William, this is still manageable. The ledger examination may not produce what Drummond is expecting. I need you to speak to Judge Carr." And William's voice, quieter, slower, with the particular weight of a man who has been thinking for 5 days and has arrived somewhere he doesn't like. "I'm not going to speak to Judge Carr, Victoria. This is family." "Stop." A pause. "Stop saying that," William said. "Every time you say that word to me, I think about what you've built on it, and I find I like it less." Another pause. Longer. "You knew," Victoria said. Different tone, harder. "You knew something was wrong when you dismissed her." "I didn't know enough," he said. "But you suspected." "I suspected," he said, "that you had moved very quickly and very deliberately for a woman who had arrived as a concerned cousin. I suspected that your attorney had been present before there was any stated reason for an attorney." I suspected a number of things, and I chose to ignore them because I was looking for a reason to do what was convenient, and you provided one. Then we are the same, she said. No, William said. We are not the same. I made a mistake because I was proud, and I didn't want to examine my own convenience too carefully. You planned a fraud for 2 years and executed it against a woman who had spent 6 years protecting everything I own. Those are not the same thing. The kitchen girl moved away from the hallway then, because she was not a woman who eavesdropped further than necessary. But she had heard enough to know which way the wind was blowing inside that house, and she told Ruth, and Ruth told Abigail. Abigail sat with this information for a long time. She was glad William had said it. She was not ready to feel glad about William specifically, but she was glad he had said it, because it mattered, not to her case, which stood on its own documents, but to some quieter place inside her that had been waiting to know whether he understood what he had done. He understood. That was something. Not everything, but something. The court-appointed accountant finished his examination on the 4th day. His name was Mr. Frederick Cole, and he was a precise, humorless man who had spent 30 years examining accounts and had developed in that time the particular personality of someone who finds fraudulent arithmetic personally offensive. He submitted his report to Judge Carr at 3 in the afternoon and delivered a copy to Drummond by 4. Drummond read it and brought it directly to Clara's house. He set it on the table in front of Abigail and said nothing. He let her read it herself. Cole had found 17 alterations. Not 14, 17. 3 more than Abigail had documented, all from 1815, before her copying system was fully organized. Everyone followed the same method. Everyone targeted a low documentation transaction. The total sum represented by the alterations was $412, not $342. Victoria's attorney had apparently calculated the total from the altered records themselves, which contained an arithmetic error that Cole noted with what read, in the flat language of professional accounting, as barely contained contempt. At the bottom of his report, in a section titled Conclusion, Cole had written, "The alterations present in the official ledgers are not consistent with clerical error. They are consistent with deliberate, systematic modification by an individual with access to the original records and the intention to create a false appearance of financial irregularity. The pattern of selection demonstrates foreknowledge of the documentation structure of these accounts." Abigail read that last sentence twice. She set the report on the table. "It's over," she said. "For Victoria Ashford," Drummond said. "Yes." She looked at him. "The reconvening is tomorrow," he said. "I'll present Cole's report along with the Vance partnership filing and Ashworth's conflict of interest. At that point, Judge Carr will have everything he needs to refer this matter to the circuit prosecutor." He paused. "Miss Carter, you should prepare yourself for the fact that tomorrow is going to be public in a way that today was not. Word has moved through this county. People will be there." "I know," she said. "And William Harrington will be there." She knew that too. "I'll be ready," she said. Ruth, from across the table, said nothing. She just reached over and covered Abigail's hand with hers and left it there, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. She did not sleep well. This was not a surprise. She lay on the pallet at Clara's house and stared at the ceiling and listened to the breathing of the people around her, Ruth and Clara and Mary, all of them asleep with the comfortable efficiency of people who had done what they could and were resting before the next thing. And she let herself think about tomorrow without the professional discipline she usually applied to her own thoughts. She thought about walking into that courthouse as a woman who had been publicly accused of theft, who had been dismissed from her position after 6 years, who had been called adequate by a woman who had spent those same 6 years in Richmond not managing anything. She thought about standing in front of the county and saying, "Here is what I did, and here is what she did, and here is the difference between them, and let me show you the paperwork." She thought about whether it would be enough. Not legally. Legally, she was confident. Cole's report alone was enough. But there is a difference between being proven right and being restored, and she knew that even a complete legal vindication does not automatically undo the way people look at you after they've been given a reason to look differently. The county knew what the accusation had been. The county had heard Victoria's version for 12 days before it heard Abigail's. Truth corrects the record. It doesn't always correct the memory. She let herself feel the full weight of that at 3 in the morning, because she believed in being honest with herself about the things that might be hard. Then she set it aside and thought about Daniel, who had been 19 when she taught him to read, and was now 19, and employed nowhere because he'd walked off his job to follow her out of a house that had wronged her. And she thought about Thomas and Samuel and Ruth, and she thought about the fact that whatever tomorrow cost her personally, it was going to cost them something too, and they had paid that cost without being asked. She owed them her best performance tomorrow. She sat up in the dark and opened her satchel and went through the documents one more time, and by the time the first gray light came through the window, she was ready. The courthouse was full, not courtroom full, county full. People standing in the corridor, people in the yard outside, people who had no professional connection to the proceedings, but who had heard what was happening and made the calculation that this was the kind of thing worth seeing. Abigail walked in with Drummond on one side and Ruth on the other, and she looked at none of them. She looked at the front of the room, and she walked toward it, and she sat down, and she opened her satchel, and she was ready. Victoria was already seated. She looked like a woman who had decided overnight that composed was the only available option and had committed to it completely. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded. She looked at no one. Ashworth was beside her, and he looked like a man who had received Drummond's conflict of interest filing that morning, which he had because Drummond had ensured it was delivered at 8, and who was now sitting in a courtroom having the professional experience of watching the floor come up to meet him. William came in last, through the side door, and he sat in the gallery rather than at the table with Victoria. That placement was not accidental. He had made a decision about which side of the room to be on, and he had made it visibly, and the county noticed. Judge Carr entered, and the room came to order, and it began. Drummond presented Cole's report first. He read the conclusion aloud, clearly, into a courtroom that was very quiet, and then he placed the report before Judge Carr and said simply, "Your Honor, I believe this document speaks for itself." Judge Carr reviewed it for 3 full minutes. No one spoke. Then Drummond presented the Vance partnership filing, the consulting engagement from October 1816, the timeline of Victoria's preparation. He laid it out in the same methodical order, brick by brick, and the picture it assembled for the room was complete and unambiguous and damning. Ashworth objected twice. Both objections were denied. When Drummond finished, he said, "Your Honor, the evidence before this court establishes that the fraud allegations against Miss Abigail Carter were fabricated. They were fabricated using documents deliberately altered by a party with a planned financial interest in this estate, assisted by professional consultants, including the opposing attorney in these very proceedings, who maintained an undisclosed financial relationship with Mrs. Ashford through his business partner. We request the immediate and complete dismissal of all allegations against Miss Carter, referral of this matter to the circuit prosecutor, and a formal finding that the official estate ledgers were criminally altered." The courtroom absorbed this. Then Ashworth stood, how as a professional to the last. He made his arguments carefully and completely and without apparent panic, and none of them held, because none of them could hold against Cole's report and the Vance filing and 14 documented discrepancies that had original receipts behind every single one, and the room knew it, and he knew it, and Judge Carr's expression throughout his remarks was that of a man waiting patiently for someone to finish saying something he has already decided. When Ashworth sat down, Judge Carr looked at Victoria. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "do you wish to make a statement?" Victoria was very still. "No," she said. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Small. Complete. Judge Carr looked at his papers. "All fraud allegations against Miss Abigail Carter are hereby dismissed in their entirety," he said. "The official Harrington estate ledgers for the years 1815 through 1817 are entered into evidence as criminally altered documents. This matter is referred to the circuit prosecutor for investigation of criminal fraud against Mrs. Victoria Ashford and Mr. Gerald Ashworth. Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Ashworth, you are both directed to remain in Harrington County pending that investigation." He paused. Mr. Drummond, is there anything further on behalf of your client? Drummond looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at Judge Carr. Your Honor, she said, I would like it formally entered into the record that the accounts of Harrington Estate, as I managed them for 6 years, were accurate, lawful, and beneficial to the estate's financial health. I would like that to be the official record. Judge Carr looked at her. Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. So entered, he said. He brought down the gavel. Cheno. The room erupted. Not in chaos. In the release of a room that has been holding its breath through something long and tense and has finally been given permission to exhale. There were voices, movement, the sound of people turning to each other and saying what they had just witnessed, with the urgent energy of people who know they will be telling this story for years. Ruth grabbed Abigail from behind, both arms around her shoulders, and held on. Thomas, from somewhere behind, said something that was mostly inarticulate, but communicated complete satisfaction. Old Samuel stood from his seat in the front row and put his hat back on and looked at Abigail across the room with an expression that was quieter than the celebration around him, but went considerably deeper, and he nodded once, and that one nod meant more to her than almost anything else in the room. Young Daniel was crying. He was trying not to, in the way 19-year-olds try not to cry in public by staring very hard at the ceiling and breathing through their mouths, and it wasn't working, and he was too young to know that it didn't matter. Abigail stood in the middle of all of it and felt the morning drain out of her in the same slow way it had after the first hearing, and she let herself feel this one more fully. Let herself feel what it was to have built something true and had it attacked and held it together anyway, and carried it to the place where the truth could stand on its own. She felt it for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she looked up. William was standing 10 feet away. The crowd was moving around them both, and he was standing still in the middle of it, the way a man stands when he has decided not to move until he's done the thing he came to do, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful professional remove she was accustomed to. Not the managed distance of a man who believes facts matter more than feelings. Something stripped of all of that. Something that was simply a person looking at another person and knowing exactly what he'd done. She let him look. He crossed the 10 feet between them. Miss Carter, he said. Then stopped. Started again. Abigail. She waited. I owe you an accounting, he said. Not of money, of what I did. He was not a man who found this kind of speech easy. She could see him working for it, the way you work for something that matters enough to do even when it's hard. I chose convenience over truth. I took an accusation that was handed to me already wrapped and presented, and I didn't ask the questions I should have asked, because asking them would have required me to doubt the person who gave it to me and trust the person she accused, and I chose wrong. He paused. I chose very wrong, and I am sorry. Abigail looked at him. There was a version of this moment she had imagined during the long hours at Clara's table with her documents and her copies and her need to keep moving forward. A version where she was cold, where she delivered a measured response that acknowledged his apology without giving him anything, where she maintained the professional distance that had always been the appropriate distance between them. She found, standing in the clearing courthouse with Ruth's hand still on her arm and Samuel's nod still warm in her chest, that she did not want that version. You told Victoria you had made a mistake, she said. In your study, 2 nights ago. He stilled. She didn't come to me directly about what you said, Abigail added, but I have very good sources. Something moved through his expression that was almost, in another man, something like a fractured laugh. Ruth, I have very good sources, she said again. He looked at her. You've known for 2 days that you understood what you'd done, yes. And you didn't? I had a case to finish, she said. And you needed to say it in person. This is you saying it in person. He exhaled, long, slow, like a man putting down something heavy. Will you come back, he said, to the estate? The room was still loud around them, but this particular conversation had its own quiet, the way important conversations always do. Not as a hired woman, she said. Not to a position that can be ended by accusation and a ring of keys left on a desk. "No," he said, "not as that." "Then tell me what you're proposing." He looked at her. "A partnership. Legal. Formal. Your name on the estate management documents with the same authority as mine in matters of accounts and contracts. A salary that reflects what you actually do." He paused. "And my word, which I recognize currently has limited currency with you, and which I intend to spend the necessary time rebuilding, that nothing like this happens again without your hearing it from me directly, face to face, with time to respond." She looked at him for a long moment. "You want me to trust you," she said. "I want to earn your trust," he said. "Those are different things. I'm aware of the difference now in a way I wasn't 2 weeks ago." "What changed?" He considered this. "Everything you built," he said. "I spent 5 days watching it fall apart without you. Every system you created, the contracts, the supplier relationships, the staff management, the accounts, every single one began to fail the moment you left. Not because the systems were fragile, because I had never understood them well enough to maintain them. And I had never understood them well enough because I had never had to, because you were there." He looked at her steadily. "I thought I was running an estate. I was running the estate you built and maintained for me while I was absent, and then while I was present, but not paying the kind of attention I should have." He stopped. "I would like to correct that." Abigail stood in the courthouse that smelled of old wood and summer heat and the specific aftermath of justice being done, and she looked at a man who had failed her in the specific way that proud people fail. Not from cruelty, but from the comfortable assumption that the truth in front of them would wait while they chose the convenient story. And she thought about what her father had said, the last year of his life, when she asked him how you know when a person is worth trusting again. "You watch what they do when the convenient story is gone," he had said, "when there's nothing left to hold on to but the truth. Some people rebuild with it. Some people resent it. The ones worth trusting rebuild." She looked at William Harrington. She looked at the way he was standing, not with the posture of a man who expected a particular answer and was waiting for it, but with the posture of a man who had come to deliver something and was prepared to leave without receiving anything in return if that was what was warranted. That was something. "I need time," she said. "Yes," he said. "And a contract. Written. Before I return." "I'll have Drummond draw it up," he said. "Whatever terms you require." "My terms," she said. "Not a proposal for me to respond to. I will write the terms, and you will review them." Something shifted in his expression. Not resistance. Recognition. "Your terms," he said. She nodded once. "Then we're beginning," she said. She turned and went back to Ruth and the celebration that was still moving through the room, and she let herself be in it. Let herself feel the full weight of what had just been won and set in motion. And she did not look back at William Harrington, because she did not need to. He would be there when she was ready. For the first time in 12 days, she believed that the future was something she was building toward rather than running from. And the difference between those two directions was everything. Outside the courthouse, the Virginia summer was burning at its full August height, and Harrington County was full of people talking about what they had just witnessed. And Abigail Carter stood in the middle of all of it and felt, for the first time in longer than 12 days, longer, if she was honest, than the 6 years she had spent being useful and invisible, entirely, completely, unarguably herself. She had not won by luck. She had not won by accident. She had won because she had kept her copies, and kept her faith, and kept walking when the road was difficult. And because the truth, her father's truth, the truth she had carried in a leather satchel through everything, had turned out to be exactly what it always was. Enough. More than enough. The contract took 4 days to write. Abigail wrote it herself, at Clara's kitchen table, with Peter, Drummond's meticulous young clerk, sitting across from her and checking every clause against Virginia estate law as she drafted it. She did not rush. She did not soften. She wrote the terms as she needed them to be, with the same precision she had brought to 6 years of harvest contracts and supplier agreements, and she did not apologize for any of it. The terms were these: co-management authority over all Harrington estate accounts and contracts, with her signature carrying equal legal weight to Williams on any document below $500, and required consultation on anything above. A formal salary, not a governess wage, not an estate assistant stipend, but the salary of a managing partner, documented and non-negotiable. The right to hire, discipline, and if necessary, release any member of the estate staff without requiring William's ratification, provided she documented her reasoning. And one clause that Peter had hesitated over, not because it was legally unusual, but because he had clearly never seen it written so plainly before. In the event of any future accusation against her professional conduct, she would be entitled to full access to all relevant documents, a formal response period of no less than 14 days, and a hearing before an independent party before any employment action could be taken. Never again would a ring of keys be set on a desk without a fight first. Peter had looked at that last clause for a long moment. "Is this standard?" he asked. "It is now," she said. He wrote it down. She brought the completed contract to Drummond, who read it with the expression of a man who was genuinely pleased by what he was seeing. He suggested 2 small amendments for legal precision, both of which she accepted because they improved the document without altering its intent. Then he sent it to William. William's response came the following morning. He had signed it without changing a single term. No counteroffer, no revisions, no covering letter explaining his reasoning or asking for clarification. Just his signature, in the same deliberate hand she had seen on dozens of estate documents over 6 years, at the bottom of every page she had written. She sat at Clara's table and looked at those signatures for a long time. Then she folded the contract and put it in her satchel, next to her father's letters, and told Ruth they were going back. Ruth's response to this news was to stand up from her chair, remove her apron from the hook by Clara's door, a different apron from the one she'd left at Harrington Estate, because she had not gone back for it, and Clara had lent her one, and tie it around her waist with the decisive efficiency of a woman resuming her proper occupation. "About time," she said. Clara stood in her kitchen doorway and watched them all gather their things, and she was quiet in the way she was quiet when she felt something strongly and was deciding whether to say it. Then she said, to Abigail specifically, "Your father would have liked to see this." Abigail stopped. "He would have said it was overdue," she said. "He would have," Clara agreed. "He would have said that too." They embraced, and Abigail held on for a moment longer than she typically let herself, and then she picked up her satchel and walked out to where Thomas had the wagon ready. All 15 of them were coming back, every single one. Thomas had never officially resigned. He had said, on the road that first night, that he was taking some time away, and he maintained the technical accuracy of that position all the way back to Harrington Estate. Old Samuel had said nothing to anyone except that he had some concerns about the Southfield drainage that needed addressing, and he preferred to address them before September. Daniel, who had spent the intervening days helping Clara with the farm work and continuing to read in the evenings from the small collection of books Abigail had brought in her satchel, was quiet on the ride back in a way that was different from his usual 19-year-old purposeful noise. "You all right?" Abigail asked him. He thought about it. "I reckon I'm glad it's over." "It's not entirely over," she said. "There's still the prosecutor's case against Mrs. Ashford. That'll take months." "I know," he said. "But the part that was about you, that part's over. And I'm glad." She looked at him. "You lost 2 weeks of wages," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "That was a real cost. I want you to know I understand that." He shook his head. "Miss Carter, I learned to read because of you. I reckon 2 weeks' wages is a fair enough trade for that, and I would have gone further if I needed to." He looked at the road ahead. "Some things you do because they're right. My daddy taught me that." She was quiet. Then she said very carefully, "Your daddy was a wise man." He smiled at that. Young and wide and genuine, the kind of smile that hasn't learned yet to protect itself, and she was glad to see it. Harrington Estate, in the first week of August, looked like what it was, a place that had been trying to run without understanding how it ran. The Southfield drainage was already creating problems Samuel could see from the road. The main house was not quite right in its small details, the way a clock is not quite right when one gear is slightly off. Nothing catastrophic, everything slightly misaligned. The remaining kitchen staff had, as predicted, given notice, which meant the kitchen was being managed by Mr. Garrett with visible distress and invisible competence. Abigail walked through the front entrance, not the back, not the side, the front, with her satchel on her shoulder and 15 people behind her, and she met William in the entrance hall. He was waiting there. She wasn't sure whether he had known their arrival time or had simply been waiting, and she decided it didn't matter. He looked at her. He looked at the people behind her. "Welcome back," he said. And then, to all of them, "All of you, welcome back." Thomas nodded, the minimal nod of a man who accepts things without making much of them. Samuel had already turned toward the south fields because there was no time to waste. Ruth went directly to the kitchen to assess the damage, and Abigail could hear Garrett's relief from the entrance hall when Ruth arrived, a sound that was equal parts gratitude and profound personal embarrassment. William and Abigail stood in the entrance hall after everyone else had dispersed to their work, and they were alone for the first time since the courthouse corridor. "The contract," he said. "Yes," she said. "I didn't change anything." "I know." She looked at him. "Why not?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because your terms were fair," he said. "And because I'm aware that fair is the minimum I owe you, and I didn't want to negotiate below the minimum before we'd even begun." She looked at him for a moment longer than she needed to. "The harvest contracts," she said. "The Pemberton agreement lapsed." "I know." "I'm going to reach out to Pemberton directly," she said. "It'll take concessions we wouldn't have had to make if the contract had been signed on time, but I believe he'll renegotiate." "What kind of concessions?" "A better rate on the early delivery schedule. He wanted that last year, and I held the line because our position was stronger. Now it isn't, so we give him the rate and we rebuild the relationship." She paused. "Morrison is more complicated. He feels insulted. I'll need to go to him in person." "I'll come with you," William said. She looked at him. "If that would help," he said. "If it wouldn't, I'll stay here. I'm trying to be useful, not to take over." "It would help," she said. "Morrison is old-fashioned enough that a visit from the estate principal alongside the estate manager will mean something to him." She paused. "Just let me lead the conversation." William almost smiled. Not quite. "Yes, ma'am." It was the first time he had used that word to her, and they both registered it, and neither of them commented on it. And that was exactly right. She was back in the accounting office by afternoon. The files were where she had left them. The court had returned the original ledgers after Cole's examination, and they sat on the shelf with the discomfort of things that have been used wrongly and returned. She would deal with that in time. For now, she needed the current harvest projections and the status of the 2 remaining active contracts, and she found both in under 3 minutes because the system she had built for this room held even when she wasn't there to run it. The numbers were not good, not catastrophic. The estate had reserves she had built specifically for seasons of difficulty, but the 2-week disruption had cost them in ways that would take most of the harvest season to recover from. She worked through it systematically, charting where the losses could be absorbed and where they required active repair. And she was still working when Ruth came to the door at 6 in the evening and said that supper was ready. "I'll eat later," Abigail said. "You'll eat now," Ruth said, with the serene certainty of a woman who had been putting food in front of people for 20 years and had no intention of stopping. Abigail ate. The kitchen was full in the way it used to be, the noise and warmth of people who worked hard together sharing a meal at the end of it. And she sat at the table and felt the familiar texture of an evening at Harrington Estate settle back around her like something she had put down carefully and picked up intact. William was not in the kitchen. He ate separately, as he always had. The distance between the main house table and the working household was a convention she had never tried to change, because some distances serve a purpose. But when she came out of the kitchen an hour later, she found him on the porch. He had 2 cups of coffee. He held one out without preamble. She took it and stood beside him, not too close, with the particular calibration of 2 people who are learning a new distance and haven't determined it yet. "The harvest numbers," he said. "I know," she said. "Are we recoverable?" Yes. It'll take discipline through September, and the Pemberton and Morrison situations need to resolve cleanly, but yes, we're recoverable. He was quiet for a moment. I want to understand the accounts, he said. Not just have them managed. Understand them. I want you to, if you're willing, I want you to show me how it works, why you make the decisions you make. She looked at him. That's going to take time, she said. It's not simple. I'm aware of that. I spent 6 years assuming it was simpler than it is. He paused. I'd like to spend the next period of time being aware that it isn't. She considered this. Tuesday mornings, she said. An hour. I'll walk you through the current accounts and the decision framework. You ask questions when you don't understand something, and you don't pretend to understand when you don't. Tuesday mornings, he said. And you do the reading I give you before each session. Yes. And when you disagree with a decision I've made, you come to me directly. Not through intermediaries. Not after the fact. Yes, he said. More quietly. Meaning it. She drank her coffee and looked at whatever was in front of them in the August dark. And she let the quiet be comfortable, because it was. 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, Abigail renegotiated the Pemberton contract. She had been right about the delivery rate, and Pemberton had been willing, and the relationship was repaired in a single meeting that lasted 2 hours and ended with a handshake that held. The Morrison situation took longer, required 2 visits, and was ultimately resolved because she brought William the second time. And William said, directly and without qualification, that the prior attempt to renegotiate had been a mistake made in her absence, and that he was there to acknowledge it, which Morrison had respected because men of his generation understood the difficulty of an apology delivered face to face. Samuel corrected the Southfield drainage in 6 days. He did it without fanfare, and he told Garrett, when Garrett asked if there was anything Garrett could do to help, to bring him his lunch because he'd be working through the midday. Garrett brought him lunch for 6 days. Daniel asked Abigail, at the end of the 3rd week, whether she thought there might be a way to establish a small school in the county for children of estate workers and tenant farmers. He had been thinking about it, he said, since the hearing, since old Samuel's testimony about what it meant to have someone who believed education was worth spending evening hours on. She looked at him for a long moment. I've been thinking about the same thing for 2 years, she said. You have? I didn't have the standing to propose it, she said. Now I do. She paused. Write me a proposal. 1 page. What you think it would need to work. I'll take it to Mr. Harrington. Daniel blinked. You want me to write the proposal? You're the one who wants the school, she said. It should come from you. He stood up straighter. Yes, ma'am, he said. He brought her the proposal 4 days later. It was 2 pages, not 1, and it was earnest and imprecise and full of the specific passion of someone who understood from the inside what it meant to be given access to learning late. And it was exactly right. She took it to William on a Tuesday morning after the account review. He read it. He read it twice. This is Daniel's, he said. His proposal, she said. I intend to support it fully. What would it cost? The first year, minimal. We use the empty tenant house on the North Road for the schoolroom. I'll teach the reading and arithmetic myself for the first session. I know the curriculum, and we can't afford a dedicated teacher until we know the enrollment is stable. After the first year, if the numbers hold, we budget for a proper instructor. He looked at the proposal again. Who attends? Any child of working age on the estate or the adjacent tenant farms, she said. Morning sessions, 3 days a week, so it doesn't pull the older children from their work responsibilities entirely. And Daniel? Daniel, she said, helps me run it. He's young enough that the children will listen to him and old enough to understand what he's teaching. He's also, as it happens, an excellent reader for someone who started at 18. William set the proposal on the desk. Do it, he said. She looked at him. No review period? No. Abigail. He said her name the same way he had in the courthouse corridor, with the weight of something that has been carried a long time. You have co-management authority. Education of estate workers' children falls under estate community welfare, which is within your decision scope. I just told you what I think, which is do it. But you don't need my permission." She sat with this. "I know," she said. "I wanted to tell you, not ask you. There's a difference." Something moved through his expression. "Yes," he said. "There is." "Tuesday next week," she said. "We're reviewing the Q3 harvest projections." "I'll have done the reading," he said. She picked up her satchel and left, and the morning was full and bright and busy with the particular energy of a house that is running properly. And she walked through it with the unhurried confidence of a woman who knows exactly where everything is and what it is for and why it matters. The letter from the circuit prosecutor arrived in September. Victoria Ashford had entered a plea in the criminal fraud case. Not a full confession. Her attorney had negotiated something more careful than that, but an acknowledgement of the facts as established by Cole's examination and the Garrett correspondence in exchange for a reduced proceeding. She would not face the full criminal trial. She would, however, be required to make financial restitution to Harrington Estate for the costs associated with the fraudulent proceeding, including Drummond's fees and the wages of the staff who had been displaced, and she was permanently barred from any involvement with Harrington Estate affairs. Gerald Ashworth lost his license. Harold Vance, his partner, closed their shared practice and left the county. Abigail read the letter at her desk, in her office, with her files organized exactly as she had organized them 6 years ago when she first came to Harrington Estate with a school teacher's satchel and a letter of reference from the county minister, and she sat with it for a while. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to, and she didn't. What she felt was something quieter and more permanent. The particular settledness of a thing that has been completed. A chapter that has closed cleanly, with every loose end tied, the way her father had always said a good account should close. She put the letter in the file marked Ashford Matter, resolved. Then she went back to work. The twist that came in October was not a disaster. That was, she would think later, the thing that made it so unexpected. She had become, over the preceding months, very good at anticipating disasters. She was less prepared for something that came quietly, without warning, and was not bad at all. She was in the accounting office, late on a Tuesday evening, after William had gone through the Q4 projections with her and asked better questions than she had expected. He had done the reading, all of it, and she had found herself explaining less and discussing more, which was a shift she noticed without commenting on. And she was filing the final documents for the evening when William appeared in the doorway. She looked up. He was not in his professional posture. He was leaning against the doorframe the way a man leans when he is not performing anything, just existing in a space, and he was looking at her with an expression she had been seeing more frequently in the past weeks without fully naming it. "The school opens Monday," he said. "Yes," she said. "Daniel counted the enrollment this afternoon. 14 children." "I know," she said. "He told me twice." "He's very excited." "He is," she said. "It's one of his better qualities." William was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I rode past the North Road tenant house this afternoon, the classroom." She waited. "You built shelves," he said. "Daniel built them," she said. "I told him what we needed, and he built them. There are primers on the shelves." "We need primers," she said. "That's what the school supply budget is for, Abigail." He said it the same way he had said it twice before, with the weight of the word fully behind it, not as a name, but as something that meant, "I am trying to say something real, and I need you to hear it." She set down her pen. She looked at him. "You have built," he said carefully, "in 3 months, a school, and a renegotiated harvest relationship with Pemberton, and a repaired partnership with Morrison, and a south field that drains correctly, and a staff that is, by every measure I know to apply, more efficient and more content than they were before any of this happened." He paused. "And you have done all of it while teaching me, on Tuesday mornings, how an estate actually functions." She waited. "I don't know how to... I'm not a man who finds it easy to say certain things," he said. "That's a flaw. I know it's a flaw. I have been trying to address it." He straightened from the doorframe. "I am telling you that I see what you do. All of it. And that I would like, that I want. He stopped. Mr. Harrington, she said. William, he said. She looked at him steadily. William, she said. First time. It felt different than she'd expected. Smaller, somehow, and more real. Say what you came to say. I came to ask, he said, whether you would consider, whether there is any version of the future you're building here that has room in it for something that isn't purely professional. The office was very quiet. She had thought about this. She was honest enough with herself to admit she had thought about this, in the small hours at Clara's house, and in the careful evenings since she'd come back. In the way you think about things you're not ready to make decisions about, but can't entirely stop considering. She thought about what she had told herself when she wrote the contract terms. Never again would she operate without protection. Never again would a relationship, professional or otherwise, leave her without recourse, without documentation, without the explicit assurance that her position was secure and her voice was heard. She thought about a man who had signed her contract without changing a single term. She thought about Tuesday mornings and better questions. She thought about a man who said do it instead of let me think about it, and meant it not as dismissal, but as recognition. She thought about her father, who had loved her mother the way careful people love, not loudly, not quickly, but with the specific and total commitment of someone who had thought about it fully before deciding, and had never once reconsidered. She looked at William Harrington. I am not, she said slowly, a woman who moves quickly. No, he said, neither am I. And I am not a woman who will accept a situation that diminishes her standing in exchange for affection. I have a contract. I have a position. I have built something here that is mine, legally and professionally, and nothing changes that. Nothing changes that, he said. I would not ask it to. Then I would consider, she said, that there may be room. In the future I'm building. She paused. But it will be built the same way everything else has been built. Carefully. On solid ground. With documentation where documentation is warranted. Something broke open in his expression. Not dramatically. Just the particular release of a man who has been holding something careful for a long time and has been told he can set it down. I can work with those terms, he said. I know, she said. You've been demonstrating that for 3 months. He looked at her. She looked back. Tuesday next week, she said. Q4 review. I'll have done the reading, he said. You'd better, she said. He left. She sat alone in the office for a moment, and she let herself feel the full quiet warmth of what had just happened. Not celebrating, not analyzing, just feeling it the way her father had taught her to feel the important things, fully and without flinching. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the accounts. The school opened on the first Monday of October, 1818. 14 children arrived at the North Road tenant house, ranging from 6 to 12 years old, in their work clothes, with the specific mixture of nervousness and curiosity that children carry into new places. Daniel was there before any of them, with the primers already distributed on the shelves and a piece of chalk in his hand, and the expression of a 19-year-old who has been given the single most important task of his life so far, and is absolutely determined not to waste it. Abigail stood at the front of the room. She looked at the 14 children. She thought about a schoolteacher's daughter from the western foothills, who had arrived at Harrington County 6 years ago with a satchel and a letter, and the understanding that a woman needed paper on her side because the world wasn't always inclined to take her word for it. She thought about everything paper had carried her through. Good morning, she said. 14 voices said, good morning back, some clearly, some mumbling. One boy in the back who was too nervous to speak above a whisper. My name is Miss Carter, she said. I run this estate. I also run this school. And in this room, there is one rule above all others. She looked at them steadily. Every question is a good question. Every attempt is a real attempt. And no one in this room is here to be told they can't. Do you understand? 14 heads nodded. Good, she said. Let's begin. She picked up the chalk. Outside, the Virginia October was burning gold and amber across the county, and the harvest was coming in clean and better than projected, and Harrington Estate was running the way it was meant to run. Every gear correctly placed, every system understood by the people responsible for it, every person in their right position with their proper authority and their name on the right documents. Ruth ran the best kitchen in the county and had no intention of being replaced. Thomas ran the stables with the same quiet competence he had always had. Old Samuel fixed things before they broke, which was the mark of a man who understood the difference between maintenance and repair. Daniel, 3 mornings a week, stood in front of 14 children and taught them to read with the specific passion of someone who had been given that gift late and understood its full weight. And Abigail Carter, whose name was on the estate management documents, whose signature carried equal authority to any man's on any contract below $500 in Harrington County, who had built a school and repaired a harvest season, and taught an estate owner how his own accounts worked and walked out of a courthouse with the truth in her hands. Abigail Carter ran it all. Not because she had been given permission, not because she had been rescued or restored or handed something by someone more powerful, because she had kept her copies, and her faith, and her father's lessons, and her own unshakable understanding of what she was worth. And she had walked back into the world that had tried to diminish her and built something on its grounds that could not be taken away. She had chosen her own life, and she lived it, fully and exactly, on her own terms.